Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Timothy Noone's Chapter 27, Divine Illumination, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
We have a little bit of time here today, Chuck, to maybe just approach at a high level a very interesting chapter in the Cambridge history, and that is Divine Illumination, Chapter 27, by Professor Timothy Noone. And as one could probably guess from a discussion about illumination, light ends up taking a center stage here. And I think that's really, you're almost missing something fundamental and crucial about not only Christian theology, but about the impact that it had in the discussions in the medieval period, just how important it is that light fits into the cosmos, into our understanding of the reality that we live in. And I think it's fair for us as Christians to keep pointing out that the importance of light, and not just as a physical manifestation, but as a divine evidence. We talk about divine illumination, and that doesn't just mean light shining, but there's a metaphor here that the professor talks about right away, and that's the idea of the theme of light as a metaphor for understanding intellectual cognition. So it's not just that we live in a reality where we live on the earth and there's sunlight, but also the way the sun lights the world we live in, so too there's a divine illumination in our minds. And it really is fundamental. And we'll do our standard thing here, talk about some of the backstory before we get into what the medieval thinkers thought, and also maybe before we get into some of the applications that the moderns have. But Chuck, this really is crucial. And this is, I think, one of the most important things for Christians to continue emphasizing and talking about when it comes to interactions in the world with other people, is this concept of light and how the divine illuminates us. And that's a broad way of putting it, but so important. And Chuck, I just wanted to throw it over to you to just maybe kick the ball off with what's at stake with this topic and the role that you think it makes for us to study this phenomenon and to think about it in a spiritual sense as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that introduction, and really that focus on that metaphor of light is such a scriptural focus, and it is maybe something that we need to regain. And while our theories may not be exactly the same as medievals, I think we have lost something by entirely losing that illuminationist way of thinking about how do we learn truth? How do we see what is true? And it reminds me, when I was a kid, I attended schools that were part of Christian Schools International. Before that, they were called the National Union of Christian Schools. And as part of their logo, they always had that short verse. I can't remember where it's from, but the verse said, "In thy light we see light." And that is just such a meaningful verse for an organization of educators, Christian educators, to use. In thy light we see light. And reminds us that all that we know and all that we learn to be true, we only learn that in the light of God's truth. And exactly how that all works in our minds, and et cetera, we may disagree with people like Avicenna, who see this sort of amorphous way of shedding light on truth. There is something really important about what some of these, especially the earlier medievals were talking about, Augustine and Anselm, about how important it is to have divine illumination, have the light of God illuminating for us what is truth. And we only get to see that truth because of that light. And it's only because our darkness is moved away from our lights that we see that. And so that reminded me also of another metaphor that relates to light and seeing that I grew up hearing a lot, which was John Calvin's discussion of how we must look at the world through the spectacles of Scripture. And so we have now all these things that we can see, but our eyes have been darkened, or our lenses are twisted a little bit because of sin. But then when we put the corrective lenses of Scripture on, that light now is bent in a proper way so that we can see truth. And we always learn through the spectacles. This was a really good chapter, and in fact, I am quite certain that Professor Noone is a Christian. He teaches at the Catholic University of America, if I recall. And at the very end, he makes a little bit of a side comment that I thought maybe gives a little bit of a hint as to where he's thinking. And he talks about how the focus of epistemology shifted from the problem of eternal truth and certainty to the topic of universal knowledge analyzed through competing versions of intuitive and abstract cognition. And when the problem of eternal truths was later revived in the generation of Francis Suarez and Descartes, the Illuminationist tradition was all but forgotten. Whether this judgment of the centuries is final remains to be seen, for the problem of eternal truth seems to have a surprising resilience. And I wrote 3 exclamation points after that final comment, because I think there's a lot in that last couple of sentences that I think ought to maybe direct how Christians think about these.
Yeah, beautifully said, Chuck. Thank you for that. Skipping ahead to modernity, and this is terrible to forgive me. We find in the modern the turn to self, the phenomenology, where humankind is the measure of all things, to quote Protagoras, this humanistic, man-centered approach. And ostensibly, on the surface, the justification for this starting point, most modern philosophers will trace it back to Descartes' interesting philosophical premise: I think, therefore I am. And whatever else one can be skeptical of or be skeptical regarding. By positing that principle, Descartes considers that we can at least be comfortable with speaking of ourselves. Human starting point, in the eyes of many humanists, seems to be very philosophically maintainable and justifiable. I think as believers, Christians who are essentialists and not existential, as the humanist approach is, I think we have something that is just as strong as Descartes' statement, if not stronger, that ought to pull us into essentialism. And that is, of course, the existence of light itself, not merely as something that shines out of the celestial bodies and reaches us, but this idea of accounting for humankind's ability to even attain truth on the basis of a divine light. Noone says at the beginning of the chapter, God's light is required to account fully for how humans are capable of attaining the truth that they manage to attain through their intellectual activities. Now, he's stating out a thesis. He's describing the landscape. He's not justifying his position by stating it, but he is stating where this position comes from. And if we have no reason philosophically to doubt the existence of self, I would offer we have even less reason to doubt the existence of light and of the association of the divine illumination with that. And I wanted to just read briefly the stirring opening lines of Genesis chapter 1. And we'll see how, in contrast to a man-centered approach, God bootstraps knowledge of himself through the creation that he speaks into being. And let me just read the verses and we'll talk more about that. So Genesis chapter 1 starts off, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. There's something stirring in these lines, Chuck. There's something that presents itself to you and to I, the human reader, in a normative, authoritative way. And I think it comes against the idea that the most certain thing in reality is, I think the most certain thing that we understand from this divine revelation, this divine illumination, is that we live in a created reality. And the ambassador representing God's creative activity comes to our door every day when the sun rises. When you and I see light, we are reminded of that tie-in to the ultimate basis of reality, this link between the transcendent God and the creation that he's created is established in the very first phrases of the Bible, this divine revelation of God. And so I think we believers, we essentialists, have something to answer the humanists. When they want to focus on self, I think we have a higher first principle to work with. Now, that's a lot to open with, Chuck, but how does that strike you? And what do you think about the Bible's relationship to light and what it means to us being pieces in the reality that God has created?
Yeah, I love that you started with Genesis 1 there. And I think there is a reason there's an account of creation that begins at Genesis 1 verse 1 and goes through Genesis 2 verse 1, and then there's that second account of creation that starts at Genesis 2 verse 2. And so there are people who would say, "Oh, that's a conflict." I don't think there is any conflict at all. And I think that there is a reason why the first account is the first account and why it begins with that idea of light coming into a universe that was formless and void. And because that does tell us about, first of all, it tells us something about God, that God is the creator, and it is through God that everything has been made, and everything else is a creature of God, and God is the only non-creature. And it tells us something about the importance of that light. It's only through that created light that we can see anything. And then what I think is later, obviously there is that first, second, third day, and then you get to the fourth, fifth, and sixth days where there is a real parallel between what happens on day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5. And one of the things that's neat, then on day 4, you have the creation of the sun, the moon, and stars. And one of the things that I think is really neat about that idea, obviously, God created our solar system the way he did for all sorts of reasons. And for example, the fact that we are a planet that has a large moon, which appears to be not particularly common in the universe, although perhaps the new space telescope that went up yesterday will tell us even more about that. But I think the fact that we're learning that that's not particularly common may actually be very purposeful on God's part. In that, what we have is we've got our source of light is the sun, right? And then you get illumination from the moon. But even very early scientists, even we're talking about in ancient times, there was some recognition that the moon was not its own source of light, but rather was a reflection. And to me, there is something about that relationship tells us a little bit about who we are and the centrality of God and his word in shedding light, and how yet there is a sense in which the Quakers often talk about the inner light. And now certain Quakers have taken that so far, as to be unrecognizable, but the more conservative Quakers, including many of those who several hundred years ago were a great deal of influence in the States, especially in places Pennsylvania, understood that inner light in a way that still required the light of Scripture and the light of God. And there is a sense to me, I think, in that as Christians, we can agree to some extent with Descartes and with others who recognize that there is something in us, there is some light in us that allows us to see that there is this inner light, there is something about humanity. But we have to realize that inner light, that light of humanity, that light of who we are as humans, is entirely a reflection, and an imperfect reflection of the true source of light, which is God, which is in the solar system, sun reflecting, and the moon really just simply reflect the light of sun. And so I think there's something really neat about that creation narrative and that framework that is used to help us to understand creation, because it tells us not only about just simply the physical creation, but it tells us a lot about the relationship that we have with God. And we are in many ways, as humans, we're the crown of creation, right? God created us to be a little lower than the angels, as it says in Psalm 8. And there's something very valuable about being human, and there is some, in a sense, that inner light that we can learn under, but it is still all entirely a reflection, entirely dependent on God, our creator. And without God, our creator, there would be no light. We would be in utter darkness. And just like for the creation of the earth, the whole universe would be formless and void. And the only reason that we're not that is because of God's creative work. So that is, I appreciate your going to Genesis 1 there, because I think that is a really good way to think about this particular chapter and this idea of divine illumination.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. There's a further tie-in here that I wish to build upon just briefly. I know we're almost out of time for our discussion session here, but you mentioned a second creation story in Genesis. If I can be a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, I'd actually like to point you and the readers, the listeners, to what I would tongue-in-cheek call a third creation story, and that is the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And let me read John chapter 1 and think about the tie-in that it presents with respect to the creation story and the role of light, the role that light plays in Genesis. And I'll just start reading. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And so the scriptures tie in one of the most unarguable aspects of reality. Something even stronger than the existence of self is the existence of light. And with this stirring and beautiful text, the divine author ties in this idea of authority, of power, of wisdom, of life being associated with light, and consequentially not being associated with darkness. Now, this passage isn't necessarily speaking about light in a sense that you would study it in a physics class, but it is relating that physical phenomena to the creative act, to the will of God as maker, and it's a much better first starting point for investigations into reality. One could more easily deny the existence of self, I would throw out there, than one could deny the existence of light. And I say this because many phenomenologists have denied the existence of self. After all, that's one of the dangers of solipsism, is that there's nothing else but self, and we're not even sure that's there. But I've never met any philosopher who has denied the existence of light. So I just wanted to start that off. Chuck, let me throw it over to you for a final word here for this session.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That first of all, I like how you call that the third account of creation, because I think there's some real truth to that. There is something really neat about that John. And I recall as a kid, John 1 verse 5, where it says that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. That was something that we had hanging on our wall in the Christmas season here, talking the day after Christmas Day. I think that's a really appropriate way even to think about Christmas. We know that probably Christ wasn't actually born on December 25. When you look at scripture, it appears to have taken place in the spring. And yet the church choosing to celebrate Christ coming into the world at a time when the seasons, this is the darkest time of the year. And there's this promise that the light has come into the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. It really tells us about Christmas and about the not only God's creation and his creation of light and his shedding light on his word and the fact that his word is a lamp to our feet, but then he has kept all his promises through this light, through his son, the word, coming into the world and bringing light to the world and not allowing the dark to overcome it. That is, as you say, a very powerful image, and one that needs to be at the very core. We may come to different conclusions about particular doctrines and things, but this is really at the very core of who we are as Christians. We believe that God is the creator, and we believe that we are stained by the Son. And so the light of Scripture and the light of the world, Jesus calls himself later in the New Testament, the light of the world. That light of the world has not been overcome by the darkness and stains us and allows us to see the truth. And that gets back again to that scripture, in thy light we see light. Truth is visible only because of the light that God has created and has shed on, that allows us to see. Really, really good discussion. And I appreciate your bringing in those really key texts to the way that we think about this issue of illumination. So thank you for doing that.